where she spent her early life until she became queen. At that time, Kensington was a quiet district cut off from the bustle of the main city by market gardens and country lanes. The palace was not a very comfortable home from all accounts. In later years, Victoria called it dreadfully dull, dark and gloomy, and referred to our Kensington friends, the black beetles, for it was infested with insects. Victoria's mother was a German princess, and her father was Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III. The Duke of Kent's eldest brother was already reigning over the country as regent, since George III had been blind and mentally ill for some years. The regent was crowned George IV in 1820. Not many months after Victoria was born, her father died heavily in debt, leaving his Duchess and her family, Princess Theodora and Prince Charles, children by her first marriage, and Victoria, penniless. She was thinking of returning to her home in Germany when her brother, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, came to her rescue and made her an allowance. The family lived on this until 1825, when Parliament recognised that Victoria was the probable heiress to the throne, heiress presumptive, and voted £6,000 yearly for her education and keep. As a child, Victoria was given to outbursts of rage and would stamp her feet and shriek to get her own way. She positively refused to learn her alphabet. Later, her governess, Baroness Letzen, won her over, and she grew into a well-mannered and polite little girl who loved to ride her donkey and enjoyed Punch and Judy shows. During these early days, Victoria's kindly uncle Leopold took a great interest in her, until he became King of the Belgians in 1831. He lived in Surrey, and it was a great treat for Victoria to visit him there. Many of Victoria's royal relations, however, both German and English, were disreputable. Her mother felt that she should have as little to do with them as possible, and kept her from seeing them. This did not please William IV, who had become king in 1830 on the death of George IV. The Duchess was firmly supported in her view by Sir John Conroy, Comte Controller of her household, who was an ambitious man, anxious for power. Victoria hated him, although she was quite friendly with his daughter to start with. So here is an illustration of Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, 1786 to 1861, and on this side is Sir John Conroy, 1786 to 1854. Later, when Victoria became queen, 6 o'clock in the morning on June the 20th, 1837, Victoria slipped on a dressing gown over her nightdress and walked alone to her sitting room in Kensington Palace. There, the Lord Chamberlain and the Archbishop of Canterbury knelt down and told her she was now Queen. Here is a picture that illustrates that on the right. At 9 o'clock that same morning, Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, called. In her diary, Victoria underlined the fact that she saw him alone, without Mamma or her governess fussing over her. Shortly afterwards, she held her first Privy Council, which she conducted calmly and clearly. She was an instant success in court circles. Now here is an illustration of Lord Melbourne, 1779 to 1848. The young Queen quickly showed her will and determination. Her widowed mother, the Duchess of Kent, who had hoped to remain very much in the limelight, was put firmly in the background. Victoria immediately ordered her bed to be moved from her mother's room to a separate bedroom of her own. Later, when the household moved to Buckingham Palace, her mother, the Duchess, was expected to send a note asking for permission before she visited the Queen's apartment. In contrast, Victoria had a great affection for Baroness Letson, who was asked to stay on at court to help with personal matters and with letters. Now that she no longer referred to her mother for everything, Victoria needed an adviser, and she was lucky enough to have two extremely able men at hand to help her. One was Baron Stockmar, who was sent by her uncle Leopold to give her advice and guidance. With the many difficulties surrounding formal and social occasions of life at court, the Queen had complete confidence in him, and he always placed the interest of the Queen and her country before all else. And here is a picture of him. The second was Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, who with affection and skill set out to instruct her in the work of government. His tactful, worldly wise advice gave Victoria support and courage. Lord Palmerston, here, the Foreign Secretary at this time, also played a part in her early training. So the reign of Queen Victoria started in style. She was a great success at the formal and rather boring official dinners and receptions, although she much preferred riding and theatre going. She loved informal parties and was always happy to stay up half the night dancing and then watch the sun rise behind St. Paul's and the towers of Westminster. And here is an illustration at the bottom of sunrise behind St. Paul's. There is St. Paul's Cathedral, and here is the Thames. All this energy and youthful enthusiasm was a wonderful change from the dull and quarrelsome court life when her uncle William IV had been king. This happy state of affairs did not last. Her beloved Lord Melbourne had to resign because his government did not have the country's confidence, and she had a row with his successor, Sir Robert Peel. Victoria did not like Peel, whose chilly smile she described as like the silver plate on a coffin, although later she learned to appreciate his statesmanlike qualities and loyalty. The row was over the Queen's ladies-in-waiting and was really due to a misunderstanding. All the ladies were wives of men in Lord Melbourne's party, the Whigs, and Sir Robert wanted some of them replaced by ladies whose whose husbands were from his own party, the Tories. Victoria thought he wanted all her ladies replaced, and she refused point blank. Not even the Duke of Wellington, who was always sent for in moments of crisis, was able to persuade her to change her mind. In the end, Sir Robert was unable to form a government because of the difficulty. Lord Melbourne came back and struggled on as Prime Minister until 1841. The man who had by far the greatest influence on the Queen's life, however, was her husband. On the 10th of February 1840, Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Here he is. This handsome young man from Germany had been taken in hand and groomed for his future job by Baron Stockmar 2 years earlier. Although he had been more or less chosen for her by Uncle Leopold, Victoria soon found she had fallen in love and never ceased to adore Albert. She openly doted on his beautiful blue eyes, his exquisite nose, the pretty mouth with delicate moustache and slight, but very slight, whiskers, as she wrote in her diary. The prince was gifted as well as being one of the best-looking men in Europe, and had wide interests. Even so, Victoria still preferred to dance all night rather than sit and listen to his earnest discussions with authors, scientists and economists. Albert refused to let her order him about. She was queen, but she was also his wife, and in those days a wife was expected to love, honour and obey her husband. Victoria soon realised she had married not just a handsome prince, but a man of great intelligence and virtue. They settled down to a happy family life and had 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters. Princess Victoria was born at the end of 1840. Then came Edward, Bertie, Prince of Wales, who eventually succeeded Victoria as King Edward VII in 1901. As the heir to the throne, Bertie's education was very strict, but he was a disappointment to his parents, since he was not clever. However, he later became a popular prince, both at home and overseas, and served his country well. So down here we have children of Albert and Victoria. Here is Prince Alfred. This is the Prince Consort, Princess Helena, Princess Alice, Prince Arthur. The baby is Princess Beatrice. Here is the Queen, Victoria, Princess Royal, Princess Louise, Edward, Prince of Wales, and Prince Leopold. The royal couple's way of life set an example which had considerable influence on life and behaviour both at court and outside it. In time, the whole of the Queen's reign, 1837 to 1901, came to be called the Victorian Age, yet even today, Victorian is used to describe many different aspects of life during that period of over 60 years. It was an age of great contrasts, and more than one view is needed when surveying such a complex period. For example, Victorian girls, even in wealthy families, had little real education. Although Florence Nightingale managed to break free and to lead her own life, few could do the same. Upper-class parents refused to let their daughters become nurses or take a job. They were taught to view would suggest a solution to the problem. Finally, someone thought of asking the Duke of Wellington, who is here in this illustration. In answer to a summons to Buckingham Palace, the Duke is said to have replied, "Field Marshal, the Duke of Wellington presents his humble duty to Her Majesty. The Duke of Wellington has the honour to be Commander-in-Chief to Her Majesty's forces, but the Duke of Wellington is not a bird-catcher." No sooner had the Duke sent the letter than he had second thoughts. He jumped on his horse, rescued the letter from the messenger, and presented himself at Buckingham Palace, where he pronounced his advice, "Sparrowhawks." There had been other more real problems, but on the day all went perfectly. The Queen was a small figure in pink watered silk, brocaded with silver, with diamonds in her hair. Her two children, Vicky and Bertie, were at her side. As an eyewitness wrote, "No one with even ordinary feeling could remain unmoved." So down here we have a horse bus on its way to the Great Exhibition. It says Exhibition on the side and Knightsbridge just above. And here is an illustration of Victoria and Albert inside the Crystal Palace with Vicky and Bertie, two eldest children. As the opening ceremony drew to a close, an extraordinary thing happened. A Chinese man came out of the crowd and made a deep bow to the Queen. Most people thought this mysterious figure dressed in satin must be a very important person, as he shook hands with the Duke of Wellington and others. Since China had refused the invitation to the opening ceremony, nobody knew what to do, and the royal procession was waiting to start, so the Queen ordered that he should be allowed to walk in the rear of the procession with the ambassadors from other countries. In fact, this Chinese man was called He Sing and was a fraud. He was a sea captain out for free publicity, to draw people to visit his own show, his Chinese boat moored to the Temple Pier in the Thames. When all this was discovered, everyone took it as a good joke. One of the leaders of the procession was, of course, Sir Joseph Paxton, on the left here, who had designed the gigantic greenhouse which Punch had christened the Crystal Palace. Although the original idea for the Great Exhibition was Sir Henry Cole's, on the top here, the whole project really owed its success to Prince Albert's persistent support and encouragement. It was a resounding triumph. No less than 700,000 people cheered the Queen on her journey from Buckingham Palace to Hyde Park. Altogether, over 6 million visitors flocked to it in the 6 months that it was open, helped by Thomas Cook's special cheap railway excursion tickets from all over England. Many visitors saw for the first time such wonders as trains, bicycles and the electric telegraph. The telephone was not invented until the 1870s. Now here is an early steam locomotive. There were massive displays of machinery of every description, as well as silks from India, black lace from Spain, and the world-famous Kohinoor diamond. It was the first truly international exhibition and trade fair. Here is an official description of the scene looking north. In the midst is seen the Fountain of Glass. Behind it, and also in groups near the south History and Geological Museums, the Imperial College of Science and Technology, the Royal College of Art, and Royal College of Music, and the Royal Albert Hall. And that is just the short list. Even now, there is still an income of over £25,000 a year to finance educational scholarships. The Crystal Palace itself was moved to Sydenham, where it was rebuilt and opened by the Queen in 1854. For many years, all sorts of festivals were held there: concerts, firework displays, crofts, dog show, balloon ascents, and other forms of entertainment. Then, on the 30th of November 1936, it was burned to the ground. There had been beacons on Sydenham Hill before, in the reign of Elizabeth I, to warn Englishmen of the approach of the Spanish Armada in 1588. But that evening in 1936, the red glow in the sky was no signal. It was a calamity. Nothing remained but 2 water towers and a tangled jungle of molten glass and twisted iron. Today you will find in its place the Crystal Palace Recreation Centre, which was opened in August 1964. One monument to the Great Exhibition of 1851 is on the steps behind the Albert Hall. The other is the Albert Memorial in the front, a monument which perhaps sums up the self-satisfaction of the times. Prince Albert himself was keenly interested in the latest adventures and discoveries. Steamships were beginning to cross the Atlantic faster than sailing ships. The first bicycles were to be seen. Many streets had gas lighting. The Prince recognised the importance of Faraday's work on electricity, and by this means the Queen later had a telegraphic link between London and her house at Balmoral in Scotland. The other great development was the growth of railways. By 1851, the basis of our present-day railway network was in existence. Before long, the Queen's train to Scotland even had its own toilet. So the Great Exhibition marked a high point in Victoria's long reign. Progress, wealth and luxury were there to see, and the dirt, disease and poverty behind the scenes could be overlooked. Then came the shambles of the Crimean War, 1854 to 1856, and the self-satisfaction produced by the Great Exhibition was rudely shaken. Suddenly, people were forced to face the horrors of the hospital at Scutari by vivid reports printed in the Times newspaper. Florence Nightingale herself sent back reports to the government on the obstruction and evil obstinacy of army officers and doctors in the Crimea. On the right here is an illustration of Florence Nightingale, and down here we see fighting at Scutari in the Crimean War. Okay, so I am going to leave it there for now. I think we are about halfway, and I'm going to pop in my bookmark. So thank you so